Marcus had been standing at his post for 12 years without a single complaint. Every morning at dawn, he would take his position at the east tower of the royal palace, watching over the kingdom's most precious treasure, the crown jewels. His job was simple: stay alert, stay quiet, and never leave his post. The other guards often joked that Marcus was more statue than man. He rarely spoke, ate his meals in silence, and never joined their evening card games. But what they didn't know was that Marcus carried a heavy burden. His younger sister lay dying in the village below, and the medicine she needed cost more than he could earn in 5 years. Marcus had tried everything. He had asked for extra shifts, sold his few belongings, even begged the royal physician for help. But the answer was always the same: no money, no medicine. His sister had maybe 2 months left, and Marcus felt helpless watching her waste away. The crown jewels sat just 20 feet away from his post, protected by thick glass and ancient magic spells. The centerpiece was the heart of the kingdom, a ruby the size of a man's fist that could buy medicine for 1,000 dying people. Every day, Marcus stared at that red stone and wondered if the nobles who owned it would even notice if it went missing. One particularly cold morning, Marcus received the worst news of all. His sister had taken a turn for the worse. The village healer said she had days, not weeks. That afternoon, while tourists admired the jewels and nobles discussed politics nearby, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. As the sun set and the last visitors left the tower, Marcus found himself alone with the treasures he had protected for over a decade. His hands shook as he approached the display case. The magical locks were strong, but Marcus had watched the royal mages open them countless times. He knew the secret words, the precise hand movements. The heart of the kingdom felt heavier than he expected as he slipped it into his pocket. Just this one stone, he told himself. Just enough to save his sister's life. He would return it somehow, someday. As he walked back to his post, Marcus tried to convince himself that he was still a good man making an impossible choice. But deep down, he knew that his 12 years of perfect service were about to come to a devastating end. The silent guard who had never caused trouble was about to become the most wanted man in the kingdom. And the worst part was that he no longer cared about the consequences, as long as his sister lived to see another sunrise. The next morning would bring chaos, accusations, and a manhunt that would shake the very foundations of the royal court. The alarm bells rang out across the palace at exactly 7 in the morning, their urgent clanging echoing through every corridor and courtyard. Marcus stood at his post, his face showing the same calm expression he had worn for 12 years, even though his heart was racing like a wild horse. Captain Williams arrived first, his boots pounding against the stone floor as he ran up the tower stairs. Behind him came the royal treasurer, the head mage, and finally King Edward himself, still wearing his sleeping robes. Marcus had never seen the king move so fast. The display case stood open, its magical locks somehow disabled during the night. Of all the precious jewels and golden artifacts, only one item was missing: the heart of the kingdom. The empty space where the ruby had sat seemed to mock everyone in the room. How is this possible? King Edward demanded, his voice shaking with rage. These treasures are protected by magic that has never failed in 300 years. The head mage examined the case with trembling fingers. Your Majesty, someone used the proper unlocking sequence. This wasn't a break-in. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. All eyes turned to Marcus, who continued staring straight ahead as if nothing had happened. Captain Williams stepped closer to him, studying his face for any sign of guilt or nervousness. Marcus, the captain said slowly, you were on duty all night. Did you see anything unusual? Anyone who shouldn't have been here? Marcus met his captain's eyes without blinking. No, sir. The tower was quiet all night. I made my rounds every hour as required. The questioning went on for hours. Palace guards searched every corner of the tower while mages cast detection spells, looking for any trace of magic or deception. Marcus answered every question with the same steady voice he had used for years, never contradicting himself, never showing fear. But Prince Alexander, the king's eldest son, watched Marcus more carefully than the others. Something about the guard's perfect composure bothered him. In his experience, innocent people usually showed some emotion when accused of serious crimes. By afternoon, the entire palace was buzzing with rumors. Some whispered that enemy spies had infiltrated the kingdom. Others suggested that the theft was an inside job, carried out by someone with access to the tower's secrets. The servants gossiped in corners, wondering if they would all be questioned and searched. Marcus maintained his routine as if nothing had changed. He ate his simple meal in silence, checked his equipment, and prepared for another night of duty. But when evening came, Captain Williams appeared with devastating news. "Marcus, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to search your quarters. King's orders. Everyone with access to the tower must be investigated." Marcus nodded as if he had expected this moment. "Of course, Captain. I understand." As they walked toward the guards' quarters, Marcus thought about his sister waiting in the village below. He had managed to get the ruby to a merchant who asked no questions, and the medicine was already on its way to her. Whatever happened to him now, at least she would live. The search of his room would reveal nothing because Marcus had been too smart to keep any evidence there. But he knew that suspicion, once planted, would grow like a weed. His years of faithful service would soon mean nothing compared to the fact that he had been the only person with both access and knowledge needed for the theft. The investigation was about to take a much darker turn. 3 days after the theft, Marcus made a mistake that would seal his fate. While walking through the village market during his off-duty hours, he stopped at the medicine seller's stall to check on his sister's treatment. What he didn't notice was Prince Alexander following him from a distance. The prince had spent days studying Marcus, convinced that the guard's perfect behavior was hiding something. When he saw Marcus speaking quietly with the medicine seller and exchanging a small pouch of gold coins, Alexander knew he had found his proof. That evening, royal investigators raided Marcus's sister's cottage. They found the expensive medicine that no guard could possibly afford, along with enough gold to feed a family for months. When they questioned the medicine seller, the terrified man quickly admitted that Marcus had paid him with a ruby that matched the description of the stolen heart of the kingdom. Marcus was arrested as he reported for his evening shift. As the chains were placed around his wrists, he looked up at the tower where he had spent 12 years of his life. The other guards watched in shock as their quiet colleague was led away like a common criminal. News of the arrest spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The people couldn't believe that Marcus, known for his honesty and dedication, had betrayed his oath for money. Some said he must have been blackmailed or threatened. Others claimed they had always suspected something was wrong with the silent guard who kept to himself. In his prison cell beneath the palace, Marcus finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had done. He had thrown away everything he had worked for, destroyed his reputation, and brought shame to his family name. But when he thought about his sister, who was already getting stronger thanks to the medicine, he found that he couldn't regret his choice. The royal court buzzed with activity as preparations began for what would be the most talked-about trial in decades. King Edward was furious that someone he had trusted could betray him so completely. The theft of the heart of the kingdom wasn't just a crime, it was an attack on the very symbol of royal power. Prince Alexander visited Marcus in his cell the night before the trial was announced. The prince was curious about what could drive such a loyal man to commit such a desperate act. "Why?" Alexander asked simply. "You had everything a guard could want. Respect, steady pay, a position of trust. Why throw it all away?" Marcus looked up from his stone bench, his eyes meeting the prince's for the first time since his arrest. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "have you ever watched someone you love die slowly while knowing you could save them if you just had enough gold?" The prince considered this question longer than Marcus expected. "No," Alexander admitted finally. "I haven't." "Then you wouldn't understand," Marcus replied, turning back to face the wall. As Alexander left the dungeon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this case wasn't as simple as it seemed. The theft was wrong, certainly, but the man who committed it didn't seem evil, just desperate. The trial was set for the following week, and the entire kingdom waited to see what punishment would be given to the guard who had betrayed his king for love of his sister. Some called for mercy, understanding the desperate situation that had driven Marcus to crime. Others demanded the harshest possible sentence, arguing that theft from the crown could never be forgiven. What none of them knew was that the trial would reveal secrets about the kingdom itself that would shock everyone, from the lowest peasant to the king himself. The great hall had never seen so many people packed into its stone walls. Nobles sat in their finest clothes, merchants whispered among themselves, and common folk pressed against the windows trying to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. Even foreign ambassadors had arrived to witness the trial that everyone was calling the most important in a generation. King Edward sat on his throne, wearing the full crown and royal robes to remind everyone of the power that had been challenged by Marcus's theft. Beside him, Prince Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still troubled by his conversation with the accused guard. Marcus stood in chains before the court, looking smaller somehow than he had during his years at the Tower. His lawyer, a young man appointed by the court, shuffled through his papers nervously. Everyone knew this would not be an easy case to defend. The prosecutor, Lord Harrison, was the kingdom's most feared legal mind. He had never lost a case involving crimes against the crown, and he intended to keep that record perfect. As he stood to present the evidence, his voice rang clear and strong throughout the hall. "Your Majesty," Lord Harrison began, "we have before us a man who violated the most sacred trust in our kingdom. Marcus was given the honor of protecting our greatest treasures, and he repaid that trust with theft and betrayal. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about Marcus's access to the Tower, his knowledge of the magical locks, and his suspicious behavior after the theft. The medicine seller told the court about the ruby Marcus had used to pay for expensive treatments, and investigators displayed the gold found in his sister's cottage. But as the trial progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Marcus's lawyer, despite his inexperience, started asking questions that made people uncomfortable. "Why," the young lawyer asked the royal treasurer, "does medicine that could save a life cost more than a guard earns in 5 years?" "That's not relevant to this case," Lord Harrison objected quickly, "isn't it?" The lawyer pressed. "If the kingdom truly cares for its people, why was Marcus forced to choose between following the law and saving his sister's life?" Murmurs spread through the crowd. This wasn't the kind of defense anyone had expected. Instead of denying Marcus's guilt, his lawyer was questioning the system that had driven him to desperate measures. Prince Alexander leaned forward in his seat, suddenly paying closer attention. The young lawyer continued his unusual strategy, calling witnesses who testified about Marcus's character, his years of faithful service, and his well-known love for his dying sister. "Marcus never asked for money or favors," testified Captain Williams reluctantly. "He worked extra shifts without complaint and never caused any trouble in 12 years of service." The village healer spoke about Marcus's sister, describing how the young man had begged for help and tried everything legal, before resorting to theft. "I watched him cry," the old woman said, her voice shaking. "I've never seen a man so torn apart by helplessness." As the testimonies continued, a strange thing happened in the Great Hall. The crowd began to shift their sympathies. While no one defended Marcus's crime, many started to understand his desperation. Mothers thought about what they would do if their children were dying. Fathers considered how far they might go to protect their families. King Edward noticed the change in mood and grew increasingly angry. This trial was supposed to demonstrate the consequences of betraying the crown, not turn Marcus into a sympathetic figure. But the most shocking moment came when Prince Alexander suddenly stood up, interrupting Lord Harrison's closing argument. "Father," the prince said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "I request permission to speak." The king's eyes flashed with surprise and annoyance. "This is highly irregular, Alexander. Please, Your Majesty. What I have to say is important." The hall fell completely silent as everyone waited to see what the prince would reveal. Even Marcus looked up from his chains, curious about what the king's son could possibly want to add to the proceedings. What Prince Alexander said next would change everything. Prince Alexander's words rang out across the great hall like thunder on a clear day. "Father, I have discovered something about our kingdom that shames me deeply. Marcus is not the only person here who has taken what doesn't belong to him." King Edward's face turned red with anger. "Alexander, sit down immediately. This is neither the time nor place for your political speeches." But the prince remained standing, his voice growing stronger with each word. "For weeks I have been investigating not just Marcus's crime, but the conditions that led to it. What I found will disturb every person in this hall." The crowd leaned forward, hanging on every word. Lord Harrison tried to object, but Prince Alexander continued before anyone could stop him. The heart of the kingdom, the ruby that Marcus stole, was itself stolen. Not by him, but by our own royal family generations ago. I found the records in the old archives. That ruby originally belonged to the Temple of Healing, where it was used to fund medicine for the poor. Gasps echoed through the hall. King Edward shot to his feet, his crown slightly askew with the sudden movement.
That's enough!
Guards, escort my son from this hall. But the guards hesitated, unsure whether to obey their king or listen to their future king. In that moment of confusion, Prince Alexander revealed the rest of his discovery. The Temple of Healing was destroyed by my great-grandfather's army, and its treasures were taken to fill the royal treasury. For 200 years we have displayed stolen property as a symbol of our power, while people like Marcus's sister die because they cannot afford the medicine that our ancestors' theft was meant to provide. The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted in outrage, common folk whispered in shock, and the foreign ambassadors scribbled frantically in their notebooks. This was no longer just a trial about one guard's crime. It had become an exposure of royal corruption spanning centuries. Marcus stared at the prince in amazement. He had stolen the ruby to save his sister's life, never knowing that the ruby had originally been intended to save lives just like hers. King Edward's voice boomed over the noise. These are lies and fantasies. Alexander has been poisoned against his own family by radical ideas. Then explain these documents, father, Prince Alexander said, producing a stack of old papers from beneath his cloak. Marriage certificates, property transfers, and military orders, all signed by your grandfather. The evidence is undeniable. The young defense lawyer saw his opportunity and jumped up. Your Majesty, if the crown jewels were originally stolen property, then Marcus's actions take on a very different meaning. He didn't steal from the kingdom. He returned stolen property to its rightful purpose. This argument sent another wave of excitement through the crowd. People began to see Marcus not as a traitor, but as someone who had unknowingly corrected an ancient wrong. But King Edward was not finished. His voice turned cold and dangerous as he addressed his son. Alexander, you have committed treason against your own crown. Your sympathy for this criminal has led you to fabricate evidence and spread lies about our family's honor. The evidence is real, father. I can produce witnesses, historians who will confirm what I've discovered. The question now is whether we will continue to build our power on theft and lies, or whether we will finally make things right. The tension in the hall was so thick it could be cut with a sword. Father and son faced each other across the great hall, representing two different visions of what the kingdom should be. Marcus watched this royal family tear itself apart over his crime, and for the first time since his arrest, he wondered if his desperate act might actually lead to something good. But he also feared what King Edward might do to anyone who challenged his authority, including his own son. The trial that had started as a simple case of theft had become a battle for the soul of the entire kingdom. The great hall fell silent as King Edward rose from his throne, his decision weighing heavily on everyone present. The revelation about the stolen ruby had changed everything, but the king still held absolute power over Marcus's fate and his own son's future. For long minutes, Edward studied the faces in the hall, his angry nobles, the hopeful common folk, the foreign ambassadors taking notes, and, most importantly, his son Alexander standing defiant before him. Finally, he spoke. The evidence my son has presented, the king said slowly, requires careful examination. I hereby declare a recess while royal historians verify these claims. Lord Harrison looked stunned. Your Majesty, surely we cannot delay justice based on unproven allegations about events from centuries ago. But King Edward raised his hand for silence. 3 days. We will reconvene in 3 days with complete historical records. Those 3 days changed the kingdom forever. Prince Alexander's documents proved authentic, and more evidence emerged from archives that had been forgotten for generations. The Temple of Healing had indeed been destroyed, its treasures stolen, and its mission to provide free medicine to the poor abandoned. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was completely different. King Edward looked as though he had aged 10 years. The weight of his family's hidden history had clearly affected him deeply. I have spent these 3 days, the king announced, reviewing evidence that I wish I had never found. My son's accusations are true. The heart of the kingdom was stolen property, taken from people who used it to heal the sick and help the poor. Marcus felt his heart racing as the king continued. However, this historical truth does not excuse the crime committed by Marcus. He still broke his oath, violated his trust, and stole from the crown. But considering the circumstances and the original purpose of the ruby he took, I am prepared to show mercy. The crowd held its breath as King Edward delivered his judgment. Marcus, you are guilty of theft, but I sentence you to 5 years of service rather than death. You will work in the new royal hospital that I am founding today, helping to provide free medicine to those who cannot afford it. The heart of the kingdom will be sold, and the money will fund this hospital in perpetuity. Tears streamed down Marcus's face as the chains were removed from his wrists. He had expected death, but instead found himself becoming part of the solution to the very problem that had driven him to crime. Prince Alexander stepped forward. Father, I request permission to oversee this new hospital and ensure it serves all people equally. King Edward nodded slowly. Granted. Perhaps this old kingdom needs young ideas after all. But the story's impact went far beyond Marcus's sentence. Within months, kingdoms throughout the region began examining their own histories, discovering similar cases of ancient theft disguised as royal privilege. The trial became known as the Great Reckoning, inspiring reforms that would benefit common people for generations. Marcus worked at the royal hospital for the rest of his life, eventually becoming its director. His sister recovered completely and often visited to help care for other patients. She would tell anyone who listened that her brother had not just saved her life, but had accidentally saved countless others by exposing the truth about the stolen ruby. Years later, when historians wrote about the trial that rocked the kingdom, they focused not on the crime itself, but on how one desperate man's love for his sister had forced an entire nation to confront its hidden past. The silent guard who had spoken so few words during his 12 years of service had, through his actions, started a conversation that echoed across the world. King Edward lived to see the hospital treat thousands of patients, and often said that Marcus's crime had been the greatest gift his kingdom had ever received, disguised as its greatest betrayal. The heart of the kingdom was never replaced in the royal treasury, because everyone agreed it was more valuable serving its original purpose, saving lives rather than simply displaying power, and in the end, that was exactly what it did.